Going. Hello and welcome to this third webinar in the World Webinar Series. And this webinar, last week's webinar focused mainly on the science and the technology. And this week's webinar is much more political, and it's focusing on how to create a movement and specifically about how we're going to create a movement for climate restoration. I know some of you have been to previous webinars, so will know what climate restoration is. Some of you won't, that's fine. We're going to go through exactly what it is. And if you'd like any more detail, you can check out the other two webinars, one of which is on our website, one of which we're going to record again this week, and therefore will be on our webinar on our website before you see it. So just tell me if you can't see this. Can everyone see that this says the climate movement on the screen? If you can't, please put it in the chat. I'll wait a little bit. Fantastic. I'm assuming everyone can see that. So, oh, now I'm assuming someone can't see it. Let's just, the chat, for some reason seems not to be working. So, oh, yep. Oh, you're all still on slide one. Brilliant. This should be good. All right, now can you all see that? Can everyone see that? Of course, it says so we're starting with the climate movement. And before I even move on to discussing restoration, fantastic. Before I move on to starting to discuss restoration, I want to talk about the climate movement now. I must start with a disclaimer. I'm from the UK, as most of you know, and that means that my perspective won't be the same as everyone's perspective around the world, and this is probably much more Western perspective on what the climate movement is, but I still think is very relevant. I would like in future webinars to have perspectives from people from all over the world, because obviously this will be different depending on where you are in the world. It will be different in the US, it will be different in India, it will be different in Kenya, it will be different all over the world. But this is, I think, a good starting place. So I like to think of where the climate movement is today. And if I kind of ask you, what's the climate movement? Does anyone have any preconceptions? If you've got, I would like just words you think of when I say the climate movement. If you want to put it in the chat, that'd be really good. Just any words you can possibly think of when I say the word the climate movement. What's the first thing that comes into your head? I want everyone to be participating here. So everyone put it in the chat and I'll read some of them out. So we've had strikes, we've had youth, that's two. We've got activism, we've got social justice, we've got second activism, we've got protests. So the sense I'm getting is this seems to be very focused on the kind of climate activist part of the movement. And one of the things I'm hoping to show you today is activists are essential for a movement, or at least important, but movements are bigger than just activists. And there's more to movements than just activists. So I think that when you think about the climate movement, is it purely economic? Is it just wanting a shift in our economies? Is it purely political, which activism might suggest? Is it socio-cultural, so trying to change our culture, change the way we do things? Is it technological? Is it trying to change our lifestyles? I think there's a lot of things that could come under the heading of the climate movement. And I think it's important for us to think about. If anyone has a point to make at any point, there will be a lot of time to speak, but please feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question or make a point. So I think the next thing to do is to then think about these different things. So protest is clearly and is becoming an increasingly larger part of the climate movement. And by the climate movement, I'm justifying that as the movement to try to stop climate change, right? Or try to stop catastrophic climate change. So there's protest as part of it, certainly. But then there's also the intergovernmental part of it, which is, you might not think of that as part of the climate movement, but it's certainly part of the groups of individuals who want to combat climate change, be that the IPCC report, be that the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the organization where the intergovernmental negotiations on climate change happen under. There's lots of things going on at an intergovernmental level at the UN, but also with other intergovernmental bodies, the Food and Agriculture Organization, WHO, the United Nations Environment Assembly, all sorts of different things. So it's clear that that is a part of it, and maybe that's where you think a lot of the decision making is going to happen. And certainly, I think that's true. A lot of decision making is made there. There's direct action that's going on as well as part of the climate movement. Individuals going out and planting trees, farming in more sustainable ways, and actually, companies cutting their own carbon footprints just kind of for the good of it. Microsoft making its net zero declaration a few months ago. A lot of the companies, individuals doing direct action to try to combat climate change, including, for example, making lifestyle changes, people turning vegan, people stopping flying. I personally stopped flying. Direct action is clearly a part of the climate movement, and it's clearly, therefore, a movement that's bigger than just activism. Is it ideological as well? And I think ideology plays a role, where you've got some sides which are saying that the only way to solve climate change is through socialism, and suggesting that climate change can be a catalyst for socialist revolution, whilst other sides saying actually under a very conservative capitalist system, we can actually still use that as a way of combating the climate crisis, and maybe we can use the climate crisis as an opportunity to move towards a more free market capitalist way, and that's actually the only way of combating the climate crisis. And then there's people that fall in the middle as well, and people that this ideological approach doesn't fall for. There's a technological component. There's entrepreneurs making new technologies. There's governments supporting the development of new technologies, be it renewables, be it negative emission technologies, which we'll go into later. So there's clearly an aspect of this that's beyond politics as well, and into the science. And I'd like to kind of open up that question again, using this more broad definition of the climate movement as just a group of individuals trying to combat the climate crisis. And I'd like to just have another thing in the chat where everyone can put the kinds of individuals that are involved in that, and maybe revisit that question of what comes to mind when I say, rather than necessarily the climate movement, the group of individuals trying to combat the climate crisis, and organizations and governments. So I'd like to open up the chat again, and I'll read through all of those. We have scientists and spiritual leaders. Anyone else want to put anything in there that they can see as people trying to combat the climate crisis, or we're going to have? Please feel free to, like, you obviously all, because you're here, have young people still, yeah? MPs, which is obviously different in certain countries, students, organizational leaders, yeah? Yeah, I'd say that the movement is very broad, actually. Oh, we've got some more. Online community, yeah. The movement of individuals and organizations trying to combat climate crisis is very broad, and I think is much larger than a lot of what we initially suggested, of kind of just activism and going on the streets and campaigning. I think there's a lot more to the movement and to the group of individuals than there is just that. I want you all to just imagine now that a young person comes to you wanting for some career advice and says, I want to go into the career that I can have the biggest impact on helping to solve climate change. What career would you advise that young person to go into? I think probably most of you will struggle, because I don't think there is any single one. Because of the nature of climate change and the group and movement of individuals trying to combat it, and I'm not saying they're cohesive at all. There's so many different areas, from economics to politics to technology to organizational things that it covers. And I think this is really important when we're talking about creating a movement of individuals. So my next question to you all is it right? I've been calling this the climate change movement, or the climate movement, the group of individuals that I'm saying is trying to combat the climate crisis. My question to you is it right to call that a movement? And if anyone has any responses to this they'd like to share, please either put it in the chat or unmute yourself and start speaking about it. Because I think that, and bear in mind, one of the things I'm actually going to try to suggest here is, even if we call it a movement or not, the wording doesn't matter so much. I think we can say there is a very broad church of individuals, some who may strongly disagree with each other on a lot of things related to climate change, that are trying to work to combat the climate crisis. And that's what I'm referring to as the climate change movement. And why is it important that I bring this up and start talking about the climate change movement at the moment? Is if we're trying to create a movement for climate restoration, it is going to strongly interact with that pre-existing climate change movement. And it's also going to strongly interact with other movements, as well as being able to potentially take inspiration from other movements that have also happened. And the obvious, most close one is the current climate change movement, because all this is a kind of changing of that. It's not necessarily something that's hugely separate. So I said I'd explain what climate restoration is, and sorry for anyone that knows this already, this will be a little bit of a repeat. But climate restoration is basically moving beyond net zero. Is saying that the current narrative is saying we need to reach net zero at some point in the future to avoid 1.5 degrees of emission, or to avoid 2 degrees of 1.5 degrees of temperature rise, or avoid 2 degrees of temperature rise. But what climate restoration says is that's not enough, because already the climate crisis is killing millions of people overall. Not necessarily every year it's killing millions of people, it's causing millions of people to suffer, and this will only get worse, and millions of people every year will start dying from it. But if we reach 1.5 degrees, that is still an awful world for many, many, many people. And actually having 1.5 degrees as our height of ambition just kind of leaves people to die and leaves people to suffer, which I don't really think is compatible with any ideas of climate justice or any ideas of human decency. I'm not saying that anyone that advocates for 1.5 degrees is not a decent person. I think they are, very much so, but I don't think that should be the height of our ambition. Instead, climate restoration says we need to reverse the climate crisis, or at least reverse it as much as we can. It may not be possible to fully reverse, but at least try to reverse it as much as we can by not only cutting emissions and reducing the amount of CO2 we put into the atmosphere, but also sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere as well. CO2 kind of builds up in the atmosphere as if you had a bathtub. Imagine you had a bathtub overflowing. The first thing you would do would be turn off the taps, but you'd also then, if you wanted to get in, have to remove a lot of water as well. And that's what the removal part of restoration does. Restoration has three parts. You mitigate, you cut emissions, you make sure you reach net zero. You adapt because there's some changes that will be affecting people now and that we need to adapt to because we don't want to make people now still be suffering. And then you remove so that those impacts of the climate crisis that has already been happened and have been locked in then get reversed, or at least most of them, by removing CO2 and storing it safely underground. There's a huge amount of different technologies and techniques out there. I'll give you a list of 4. We've got BECCS, where you grow crops, burn them, suck the CO2 out of the emissions of burning those crops and store them underground. We've got direct air capture, where you just basically build a giant fan that sucks in air and then uses chemicals to take out the CO2 and just sucks it directly from the air. We've got natural climate solutions, which is utilizing nature to combat climate change, growing trees, things like that, wetlands, peat bogs, all things like that. That normally has a problem of kind of scaling up to a huge scale. I'm not saying BECCS and direct air capture also don't have problems of, again, scaling up amongst other things. And enhanced weathering, where you blow up loads of rocks, crush loads of rocks. Sometimes you might blow them up, but crushing is probably a better technique. And then those rocks will react with CO2 in the atmosphere and store that CO2 in them. It basically speeds up the natural weathering process. So just a few more things about restoration. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. It's also really fundamentally the movement of restoration is about the ambition and about the aim and about trying to carry it out. It's about saying we need to set the bar higher than 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is not a good place to have as the height of our ambition. We need to be saying, let's go beyond that. Because you know what? Even if we fail in doing that, right, and we only end up reaching 1.5 degrees, the fact we aim for restoration makes staying under 1.5 degrees much more likely than if we didn't aim for restoration, in my opinion. Restoration will save millions of lives and reduce hugely negative impacts socially and economically and politically the world over. The other reason I think restoration is so compelling to a lot of people is rather than the negative vision of the future that most climate narratives suggest, which is let's make it less bad, or let's stop it getting too much worse, really is the narrative. Let's stop it getting too much worse than it is now. It creates a positive vision of future that says maybe we can make it better. And it's making things better rather than just not worse. That really compels a lot of people around the world, as well as the massive benefits of keeping climate restoration. Watch our first webinar, which is going up on our website very soon, if you want much more detail for this argument. I don't have the time here to really flesh it out. Why carry out restoration? Because climate change is already terrible. Climate justice and human decency means that I don't think we should be leaving people to die and leaving people to suffer. And we're reversing a lot of negative effects that have already happened. So the question is, why do we need a movement to carry out restoration? Why can't I just try to work through other channels? Why do we need a sustained large-scale movement for restoration to ever be a possibility? Because number one, restoration has to be sustained over a very long time period. Restoration, if it's going to ever happen, will likely be over a 50 at the best, and that's probably far too small, probably at least 100-year timescale. That means that it needs broad support and consent within society from both sides of the political spectrum. If it's just one side of the political spectrum, once the other side gets in, which is inevitable, then the positive impact, then restoration won't carry on, and therefore restoration will never be achieved. So we need to create a movement to create broad consent across the political spectrum, even with people we politically disagree with. Restoration will also incur huge costs as well. I'm not as much as the benefits will definitely outweigh the costs, in my opinion. I think the costs are inevitable, that they will be pointed out. And so if particularly in democracies, which is obviously a lot of the largest emitters and the largest economies, be it India, be it the USA, be it a lot of the European Union countries, which are some of the largest economies in the world at the moment, also have historically been some of the largest emitters. These people are going to keep on voting in governments that are going to be paying for this. There's going to be broad-scale societal consent as well. And even in other countries which aren't necessarily democratic, leaders still take in societal consent as a factor in whatever they're doing. And therefore, because of the cost and because of the scale and because of the time scale, this needs a broad scale of support. It's also going to require international cooperation because of the huge task of restoration. One country can't achieve it by itself because of the huge task of combating the climate crisis and the inherently transboundary nature of the climate crisis. It needs to be an international movement, therefore, and being many countries. Otherwise, countries are just not going to cooperate with each other. It's not like certain things where if one country does it, every other country has a motivation to cooperate or to go against them. It's not really the nature of restoration. I also think, how else do you really bring large-scale international change about, except for building a movement? And this movement I want to build is both bottom-up and top-down, because we need a broad societal consent can really help manufacture conversation, political support, work by businesses, work by entrepreneurs, work by scientists. If you get a broad societal consent, or at least societal conversation, that is immensely powerful. We can see the power that that's had in the climate movement in the last 2 years, and we want to be creating something similar for restoration. But it's also top-down as well, because things need to be done at a UN level, things need to be done at a national government level. And also the UN and national governments and high-level scientists, all the kind of people you describe as like the establishment, which would be top-down, they inform public conversation. And actually there's a really great interplay between kind of the bottom-up and the top-down approach, where they're both informing each other. The kind of broad-scale society affects the decision-making of the people at the top, and then also the decision-making and the ideas and the opinions of the people at the top informs those in society with less power at that point. And so that's the reasons I think we need a movement. If anyone has any other reasons why they think we might need a movement, please feel free to respond. We'll open this up to you guys. Anyone want to speak? If you do want to speak, just unmute yourself and speak, or put it in the chat. I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to do this if you're interested. All right, totally fine. Because I've got, so my next question to you all is really, what is a movement? Who's involved in a movement? What makes something a movement? When you hear the word a movement, put it in the chat, the words that come into your head. Exact same protocol as before. What is a movement? We've got a group of people with a common aim. We've got change. We've got brings about change. I think that's pretty good definitions of it, actually. The official, we've got one more. This will be the last one I read now. Huge scale change, large scale group bringing change into society. Fantastic. So the official definition, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is an organized effort to promote or attain an end. Organized, in my opinion, and certainly in the way we're using it in this context, you may think this is not actually the way the movement should be, but that's what we're referring to when we say movement. It doesn't all mean having the same idea. It doesn't all mean agreeing with each other. It just means really people in different organized groups, these groups may not be collaborating with each other or anything, trying to promote the same end, which is combating the climate crisis, or in our case, going further than combating the climate crisis and having restoration. Sustained activities and sustained appeal. If we really want to create a restoration movement, it needs to be dynamic, it needs to be doing things, and it needs to be constantly being relevant and just being there in people's minds. And not everyone needs to be hugely passionate about it, but they need to consent. I think that's a key thing. And it's also not just political either. It's in the arts as well. It's in sciences, it's in politics, it's in culture, it's in technology, it's in academia, it's in economics. Movements can be everywhere. And actually restoration cannot be limited to a political movement either. Some examples of these are particularly political and economic movements throughout history, but and some of these move into arts and academia as well. You had abolitionism, the movement to get rid of slavery. You had feminism, the movement for gender equality. You've had colonialism, which was a movement, really. You had a broad historically, and you also had anti-colonialism and many anti-colonialist movements. You've got the movement towards globalism, which is more of an economic movement, really, and then politics kind of followed the economics. And then you've now got anti-globalism as a response to it. And I think the question is, can we learn from any of these movements and from any movements that's come before? Can we learn how to necessarily take the things that they did very well? And can we learn to do the things they did badly better? Or is our movement going to be so unique that we can't do that? If anyone wants to submit a point to this, they can do. Again, discussion's open. Do you think there's anything, if we're trying to create a movement for climate restoration, that we can learn for any movements that's going on now or has been established? If anyone would like to speak, please feel free to. Fantastic, we've got something in the chat. You can always learn from past mistakes. Managing differences and discrepancy will be key. I agree with that. Am I aware of any historical examples of such heterogeneity in movements, in participation, as well as ends? Yes, actually. I actually think feminism is a really interesting movement to be discussing here, because I think, and the movement towards gender equality has had actually initially with a lot of backlash and still does, but broadly in most places around in the world, we've got another one, this movement will be more widely aimed because everyone is affected rather than just a specific group. That's partially true, everyone would be affected. But actually with, I think, feminism, everyone was affected, whether they deemed it as positively or negatively. If you move towards equality of gender in particular, at least half the groups are affected directly, and a lot of people are affected indirectly. And I think feminism is so diverse, from kind of radical left-wing feminism to a lot of kind of very conservative ideas of feminism as well, which are particularly prominent in the West, where you've got a lot of kind of right-wing leaders actually, who are females taking on these roles, and a lot of places around the world in general. I only often will comment for the West because I've got more experience with that. I'm not saying it's not happening elsewhere in the world either. And fantastic. So what's next? So for the rest of, so that was kind of a broad discussion, and really about my thinking and the thinking of people in the movement behind what we should be doing. But now I want to present to you my vision for the movement of restoration that I want to create. Feel free to criticize any bits, to suggest things. This is all still in the working. I'm no prophet, I'm no preacher. I don't. This is just my one idea I've got. I'm not saying this is right, but I think a lot of you will be able to see the logic behind it. On the screen, you can see some of the factors I think is really important within a restoration movement. By the way, again, if anyone wants to speak at any time, please just speak. I don't, as long as take yourself off mute and speak. But it needs to be a political movement, it needs to be a social movement, and it needs to be a cultural movement. It needs to also be within the scientific world and the kind of technologists world as well. It needs to have diversity of ages. It needs to have diversity of class as well. We basically need a broad cross-section of society. It needs the diversity of race, diversity of religion within societies. Every fortnight it needs to go over. It also needs to have international components, but I'm not saying it necessarily needs to be a fully internationalist movement. I'll explain what I mean by that later on. And it, most importantly, really needs to be a broad church of individuals with differing ideas, made with hugely different things. That's how this movement is going to work. It may not even be viewed as one cohesive movement, but it needs, if anything, it just needs to be a combination at least of movements working for restoration, even if those ideas of restoration are hugely different. So I'm going to try to break it down by this. It's obviously very difficult to break society and a whole movement down into little boxes, so we will be doing some repeating. I think I put this in the best order I could do, but we'll see. So it's going to have a political component to this movement. And what would the political ends of this movement be? Well, the political part of it would be a campaign by politicians on all levels, and as well as activists, as well as basically everyone involved in the political wing of it, would be a campaign for political action into climate restoration. I'll explain in a couple of slides soon what that political action exactly will be. But here's a broad group of the groups that will be involved in the political side of it. It's going to be activists. For example, Extinction Rebellion, for example, Fridays for Future and the youth climate strikes, but also more traditional activists as well. We also have, we need NGOs as well, non-governmental organisations, all parts of civil society. We're going to need political parties, because a lot of politics is done in parties, although in some countries, obviously, it's not done in parties, and politicians as well, from all sides of the spectrum. We're going to need local, national, international levels this needs to be done on. And we don't need people who are part of the movement to be allies with each other. They can be enemies with each other. I've just got a question in the chat. Oh, no, I don't. Oh, yeah, we had something on feminism, sorry. We can learn from feminism that the public image of the movement is very important and affects how well it achieves its aims. I fully agree with that. And I think we've got to be really careful that we can create the image of dynamic, diverse movements, that not everyone in the movement even slightly agrees with each other on a lot of things. We've just got the same aim. That's one of the things I've got to have. You can have two political parties with two completely different visions of restoration. And that would be the ideal thing. And then they're strongly disagreeing with each other, just like political parties have different views on the economy, just like political parties have different views on healthcare. So let's start with political parties. We need political parties on the left and political parties on the right. I think something the climate movement has failed, and I actually think it's alienated a lot of the right. I also think that's been partially the fault, particularly in a lot of countries, particularly in the USA. But I don't think that's just the climate movement's fault. I actually also think that is a lot of the right in that country's fault as well, amongst a lot of other different factors. But we need to make sure that we're getting at least some people from both sides of the spectrum, and this isn't a partisan movement. They could use this idea to partisan aims, but fundamentally we want to make clear that this can be done in multiple ways. Why does it need that? Because of the longevity argument. This cannot be won by one side. There is in almost no country, for a very long term, one side of whatever the major political fault lines is. It's in a lot of countries it's left and right, but not in every country. There's very, very few situations, if any, that one side just wins, right? And if you want this to be a long-term thing, it's got to have support from both sides. Otherwise, it just won't last the sides the length. Parties could have different both political and economic approaches to this. But as long as they achieve the same geophysical aims, it's still restoration. Even if you think what one group of people is doing is not achieving what you think restoration should achieve, is not achieving climate justice, and is not achieving, let's say you're a socialist, is not achieving the socialist control of the economy you really want to see, they'd still be part of the restoration movement as long as they're achieving geophysical aims. I'm not saying I would even support them. I'm not saying I'd like them, particularly if they're people like racists, but they would still be working towards restoration. Not necessarily sure that's a good thing that we're having those people, but that would still ultimately, if we want this to last a long time, we have to take that into account. And we want this movement. I'm not saying Wildwood is not this movement. I'll explain what Wildwood's role is later. And how we also need debate, and we need to establish the idea, right? Even amongst groups we hate, we still need to establish the idea restoration is important. And in most cases, the best ideas are really accepted by both sides. A lot of things in politics is generally accepted by both sides of whatever the main fault lines of is. We need all sorts of figures from the fringes to the centre and everywhere in between involved within political parties. So I'm now going to move on to what each level of politics will be done. And when I said I'd give you a vision of kind of what politically should be achieved, this is that vision. So firstly, I say local politics is important. Why local politics is important? Well, firstly, I think local politics and the local and other subnational jurisdictions can be a trial ground. National governments are often not very keen on taking up a lot of new ideas that haven't been tested, while local authorities tend to have a bit more freedom to do so. And so it can provide a trial ground for a lot of policies that may then end up going upwards towards national governments. Also, local politics can help keep up momentum in this movement if national politics isn't doing it. You've just got to look at, I think the C40 is the coalition of mayors of major cities around the world to combat climate change. And that's really helped keep up the movement, particularly in places like the USA, under the Trump administration, for example. In the climate movement, we want to be keeping a similar thing, and I think local politics can be great. Also, local politics may well be the place where a lot of the action is taken out. Natural climate solutions, in particular, is very likely in a lot of countries under the jurisdiction of local and subnational, be it state level and things like that, authorities. And so they can carry out the action themselves and actually start doing things which are really important to carry out restoration. But also other approaches could very easily be carried out by subnational jurisdictions and subnational governments, and actually policies could be put in place that be effective starting ground and would be vital if restoration was ever going to really happen. The other thing is sometimes local and subnational jurisdictions can have money to spend, and not everywhere they do, but can be wealthier in certain countries. You've just got to and actually the financing, be it through, if they have control over taxation things, be it they've got control of subsidies or they've got control of spending or investment in those things. But this can actually help provide breeding ground for research and development and the scaling up of new technologies. I think you've just got to look at California, where they passed the 45Q subsidy, which basically subsidized companies if they stored carbon dioxide underground. And that's actually really helped for a lot of these technologies, particularly direct air capture, to start being developed there. And it also, subnational politics and local government, but like all politics, helps change norms and ideas of society, of politics as a whole, of national government, and on things done on an international level. And so it can have a really large impact as well. So we really need to be including these local authorities and local jurisdictions. I'm not a political scientist, so again, I just want to preface this with that. But if anyone else has any ideas of ways that they think either local government may be really useful, if anyone disagrees with some of the things I've said, please feel free to say. Put it in the chat or anything. If no one does, that's totally fine. All right, brilliant. So then next we move on to national politics, which I actually think is probably the most important. We've got someone who's gone off. Do you want to speak? You must have accidentally clicked it off. If you want to speak, just unmute yourself and speak. Otherwise, keep your mute on. Fantastic. We've got something in the chat. Thinking big picture again. I'm interested in the mechanics of this movement, how to harness existing organizations and capacities towards the common purpose, and indeed how to define the common purpose such that disagreement may be energizing and doesn't fragment the movement work against the common purpose. I will touch on this again later on, but that may be a very good idea for another webinar, or even possibly more likely, more discussion session and forming of ideas with many other movements around the world. I think that's a really good point from Karen there. And I will go back to the more activist side of the movement later on. But what would national politics want to achieve? Firstly, national politics and governments can invest in research, right? And in many different ways. They can literally give research funding. They control a lot of research funding in a lot of countries. But also they can help facilitate research done by companies, for example, by subsidizing technologies and all sorts of things like that. That's the same thing I mean by investment in technologies as well. Government can favour certain technologies. Oh, okay. Fantastic. So they can and invest in and they can actually invest and help scale up technologies. Governments have done this with lots of technologies before. You've just got to look at like the German government support of solar energy, or even the Chinese government support of a lot of renewable energies as well. That's one of them is a much more hands-on approach than the other, but I think both have shown models of how governments can very effectively support technologies. They can also, governments could set up markets or do government programs. So i.e. using government agencies, and you could have a massive government mandated project, which would kind of be a very kind of left-wing statist approach. Or you could have a more free market approach where the government just sets up a market to allow companies to compete with each other and enforcing laws which allow companies to scale up. Essentially, governments have control of their economic policy and therefore actually can have a significant, this is after all partly economic, and therefore would have a significant impact on how the economics of this work. They could support companies by giving them tax breaks, giving them subsidies, or literally propping them up and bailing them out if they get into trouble, as a lot of early companies in this will probably do because they will be startups, or through government agencies, again, a more kind of left-wing statist approach, using government agencies to achieve similar ends of the companies. Also, national politics hugely impacts culture. The way that politicians speak about things, what things that politicians do, the way that politicians comes off, impacts the norms of the people. And national politics is probably that more than anything else. National politics can help legitimize ideas. I think a lot of people in a lot of countries can see that with, I think a lot of people talk about the rise of someone like Donald Trump in America and how that legitimized certain ideas. Equally though, like I said, the interplay between the bottom up and the top down, Trump was only elected because ideas were getting popular. They feed into each other. Now, politicians that use popular ideas will get voted upon more, and the will of the people impacts the politicians, the politicians impact the will of the people. I know it's a very simplistic idea, and it's a bit more complicated than that, but that does change. And so if we've got national political support for restoration, there's much more likely to be support for it within probably scientific communities, intergovernmental communities, local governments, and within companies, as well as within the activist community. Again, they help with public consent. National politics helps dictate international politics. And the main thing that national politics has is the force of money. Governments are some of the wealthiest organizations in the world, and the force, and therefore can really make or break technologies. The force of law, because they can make laws which basically mandate certain things, can create markets, for example, can create the idea you have to pay off your historic carbon debt. There's lots of possible ideas that are floating around how they could incentivize restoration and removal, lots of things. And the other thing is they dictate international politics as well. If anyone, because obviously the UN and all these national political organizations are made up from national governments. If anyone has a point to make on this, feel free to take the mic, because I'm just going to pour myself some water very quickly, because I've been doing a lot of talking. All right, that's totally fine. I'll move on to the last one, which is international politics. And this is the last, obviously, political designation I gave. What can international politics do to help? Obviously, bear in mind, all of these things is a very simplistic reading. There's a lot more complexity to this. And these demarcations of Subnational, national, international is not always so clear, and it will change depending on the country's context, change depending on what the governments do, and change depending on all sorts of things. So what can international politics provide? They can help with assistance between governments and can help cooperation between governments, or competition between governments, which may also be very useful, competition between countries. Trade agreements can also help, and writing this into trade agreements, for example, ideas surrounding restoration can help promote it on an international scale, so that we'll be both creating international markets for it by different mechanisms, similar to mechanisms the UN and other organizations already use. But you can also write this into bilateral trade agreements, an agreement to remove a specific amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere due to the agreement. And you can add by treaties and all sorts of things like this. You can mandate different countries to carry out different amounts of restoration, just like the Paris Agreement mandates countries to cut their emissions. You can have things along very similar lines. It also allows for governance of these technologies as well. Some technologies will be techniques. Bear in mind, I don't support all restoration techniques. I think some of them are really bad science and actually wouldn't help you out restoration and would instead cause a lot of damage, like ocean fertilization, for example. But that needs governance, and if it's going to need governance, it's going to need to be done on an international scale because it's transboundary. But it also can help reinforce different principles of restoration and make sure that we're following and abiding by principles that actually make us carry out restoration. You can have also, it can help keep accounting mechanisms. So it's harder for countries to fumble the numbers, fumble the facts and things like this. It can kind of force action on international governments, but as we've seen with things like the Paris Agreement, it's really hard for them to follow, to force action on national governments, multilateral UN organizations. It's a lot easier for them to force action on smaller governments, while the larger emitters and the larger economies, it's a lot harder to. Bear in mind that when it comes to actually removals, probably the size of the economy is probably more important than how much they are as an emitter in practice. I'm not whether you think that's right or not, it's different, but I think that's probably true in practice. But I think the force of bilateral trade agreements and treaties and things like this could be more likely to force action upon national governments, but that's still limited. International politics can also raise awareness and give ideas legitimacy. But I also don't just mean international politics, I also mean the mechanisms of these international political things. Like the IPCC, which is obviously really under science, that was mandated by the UNFCCC, and it was their 1.5 degree report that actually kicked off the current wave of climate activism. And if you look at interest in climate activism, it's all around international summits. So again, it helps really raise awareness of the issue, and we could hopefully translate something similar with climate restoration. And if we've got international discussion done at the UN, discussion done at other organizations around restoration, that would actually really help feed into the bottom-up approach as well. As I said, the top-down and bottom-up interaction with each other. And it also legitimizes ideas as well. If something gets discussed in an international setting, those ideas become kind of more legitimized in the public's eyes. I think the other thing, the main thing that international politics will do, though, as an effective thing, will be the setting up of kind of markets and mechanisms that may affect it. I think a disclaimer would be that they have set up mechanisms for other ideas of removals and also other ideas of offsets and all things like that in the past, which obviously restoration is not the same as. Restoration is much more ambitious, much less spiddly than something like offsets. But those things haven't worked so well, often because they've not got the force of national governments behind them. And why they've not got the force of national governments behind them? Often because they've not got the force of society behind them. And I don't just mean like, oh, the people marching in the streets, I mean also companies and all sorts of things like this. And I think, therefore, mechanisms that international organizations could set up to help promote restoration, which, bear in mind, is not like we remove to offset some emissions we want to do, which is we radically reduce emissions to zero and then remove the historic emissions we've done. It's nothing like a lot of the current narrative of climate change at all. So if we could get legitimacy for that at an international level and mechanisms for that, we'd still need support at a national level as well. So what's the next group of people? Probably a group of people that interests you most, I'd assume, would be civil society, which is, most of us would be us guys, kind of everyone in society outside of the business world and the governmental world. So what can we do in civil society to help? Education. If we educate people, and more people are educated, more people know, more people are passionate, more politicians are passionate, all these things, we can change social norms. Education is a great thing to change society and can really help change the social norms. And we need that, as I've said, with the bottom-up approach again. It can also, certain charities, for example, and NGOs and organisations are really wealthy, not many, but certain ones like the Gates Foundation, for example, and certain individuals like Bill Gates himself, like a lot of CEOs as well, and they can fund projects and research. In fact, Bill Gates has been funding a certain carbon removal project. Obviously, that funding would have to go up if we change the ambition from just let's remove a little bit to let's carry out restoration on a large scale. Civil society would help create the groundswell of support that would bring about political change. I think we underestimate the impact that organizations, be it educational organizations, be it kind of fraternal organizations, all sorts of these things can actually have in changing the way that society functions and changing the way that we kind of think about things. It also can, if there's support within civil society, particularly from kind of well-respected organizations, then it can really give legitimacy to ideas. We need the ambition of restoration. We need to go beyond net zero, which is kind of balancing removals and emissions. Beyond, we can move beyond that to actually go net negative, and even beyond, and so we can restore. And that idea is actually really quite radical. And if we get support from legitimizing organs of civil society, that will hugely change the public support and also the support from politicians on all levels. Civil society can help carry out direct action, and individuals themselves can help carry out direct action, be it tree planting, be it ideas like Pleistocene Park in Siberia, although I know that does have some degree of government support. I'm not 100% sure, but that certainly came out of one guy having an idea that then morphed into that. So it did come from civil society, although I think it's now got some support from other sectors as well. Civil society will be the ones to start the movement. We're hoping to be ones that can help coordinate the movement, but it certainly will come from within civil society. And civil society is the bridge between all areas of society. We like to think of kind of decisions being made over the heads of civil society, but civil society actually does help glue people to get the world together. And these things that go outside of the organs of the state and go outside of the organs of private enterprise do have a significant impact on the way that we view the world and on the way that we interact with the world and on the way that everyone interacts with each other. So we need support within civil society to carry this out as well. Support from the media, which obviously is part of civil society, but I think it's important because the media directs conversation, directs ideas. We've got a question in the chat. Yes, I'd say this webinar is part of civil society action. Yeah, WorldGood is after all a kind of a part of civil society. So yes, this webinar is exactly that. I think that's a really good point. From within the media, they direct conversation and the media end up kind of decide, that's where a lot of ideas get discussed and where a lot of the debate that influences and changes how society works happens there. It affects how people vote, it affects how politicians act, it gives certain things legitimacy, certain ideas, certain politicians legitimacy, takes it away from others. It can unfairly criticize movements, it contributes to that bad public image, like Sean mentioned in the chat earlier. It can positive to a good policy image as well. The media is one of the key ways in which we inform ourselves about the world, and really one of the key ways that everyone informs the world that way. Also, the media is one of the key ways that this movement would gain awareness. Things don't just gain awareness out of nowhere. Everyone doesn't manage to find one small organisation on the internet, think, oh, that's great, let's go join there. Things need to gain media attention. Increasingly, however, some of that raising awareness role and some of that discussion role is actually getting usurped by social media. To the extent to which media itself and the traditional media is so important, I think is getting less and less as time goes on. But I still think it's hugely important. Activists, I said I'd move back to here we are. What can activists do? Like I said, a movement, we like to think of activists as the entirety of a movement. Activists are actually one small part of it. Activists are great at raising awareness because they get in the media, because they pull stunts, because they pull ideas, and that raises a huge amount of awareness. You've just got to think of the extent to which Extinction Rebellion and the school climate strikes has raised awareness. Raising that awareness and raising public concern drive political action. That all the net zero declarations that happened all over the world was, oh, we've got something in the chat. Can we make impact within religious communities? 100%. And actually, I've got a section on religion, which is coming up. And I think, yes, religious communities is really important. We can actually kind of activists drive political, are one of the, activists are not the only way of driving political change, but they are one of the ways in which we drive political change. And I think that's important to remember. They bring ideas and thought and passion and an emotional aspect to the conversation. And emotion resonates with a lot of people, and activists really have that. Politicians respond to people marching in the streets in some way or another. A lot of the great movements that have caused huge amounts of change, be it in the civil rights movement, be it in the current climate movement, have had huge amounts of activism in them that has really helped bring the awareness to the fore, raised public concern, and ultimately driven political action. But also bear in mind, like I said, it doesn't just need to be political change, it needs to be societal change as well. And activists can raise that awareness, and if people change and people change the way that they think, then that can bring about societal change. Also, if activists start taking direct action to target businesses, like divestment and other things like that, businesses are relatively likely to change. Businesses do like a good public image. If businesses start going kind of badly because of activism, then they are likely to change. Activists do what activists do best, which is convincing and basically bringing the discussion to the floor. It's kind of it throws down the gauntlet to say we've got to have a discussion now. That's really one of the things activism keenly does. Amongst other things, I think you can all say there's a lot more I could be adding. Arts and culture. Arts and culture, I think we underestimate how much arts and culture affects the conversation, particularly arts that's widely consumed. One of the best examples of this, I think, was the David Attenborough Blue Planet documentary, Blue Planet 2 documentary, which, interesting fact, actually, when the final episode was screened, it slowed the internet in China by a considerable amount. It was watched that much. That basically, particularly in the UK and then eventually around the world, I think, led to a lot of banning of single-use plastics and changing of policies related to plastics because of that one documentary. Arts and culture changed the way we view the world. Why have a lot of kind of totalitarian regimes want to crack down on the arts? Because arts are a way that the world, that societal discourse goes on. Because we hear the world through stories, and arts and culture tells that story. And the story told about restoration will affect how much we accept the ideas of restoration. If we tell a story of hope and a story of this diversity of this movement, and a story that we can get this done and this kind of attitude, then this may well come about. If we tell a negative story, it's much less likely to come out. That's why I think restoration is much more hopeful than the traditional climate narrative. The traditional climate narrative tells a story of despair. Restoration tells a story of hope. Climate change, the arts and culture and figures within arts and culture have a huge platform. Some of the biggest platforms are people outside of politics. And therefore it can create legitimacy, create political action. And again, just like activists can put that conversation out there and can make people change their own ways, can make companies change their own ways, but most importantly, will again inform the way that politicians act, but also the way that people expect politicians to act. Yeah, we've got something in the chat. Fantastic, it's just a quote that I just said. You can read through the chat. And finally, the arts and culture are one of the ways we're educated about the world. If people are more educated about things, people are more empowered, things are more likely to change. Let's see the next slide. Science. Science has to be part of the movement, although not part of the political side of the movement. We need a movement within science to carry out more research on carbon removal and the carbon removal are the techniques we need to carry out restoration. But these need funding, and therefore requires a lot of those political change so that funding can happen, because a lot of that funding will come from governments. We also need people in science constantly coming up with the technologies we need and making those technologies cheaper. There's a lot of hard work to do on technologies, and particularly making it cheaper might need a lot of competition from companies if you view the way the world works like that, the way the economy works like that. And therefore we kind of have this great like movement we need to create in science, which is trying to collaborate more or compete more and more a focus on carrying out the carbon removal. There's collaboration and competition on carbon removal techniques. We need to create more knowledge and more expertise to help make this work. If we're going to have supply chains on a huge scale, like we're probably going to need to carry out restoration, we need more expertise, we need more knowledge. So we need more work done in the scientific community to help promote that knowledge and expertise, as well as connecting people that have it. We need fundamentally connections with the people that are going to bring about the technological and scientific changes. And there's lots of great organizations out there already doing the work within the scientific community, but more needs to be done. Scientists can help give legitimacy to ideas, and but also can criticize them as well, and can be ways of combating bad science. But we need good scientific communication as well, which I think is something we're sometimes lacking. Although I think there's also some great scientific communicators as well. There's certain unsubstantiated norms, I think, within the scientific community about, for example, the level of ambition that is politically pragmatic. That political pragmatism isn't related necessarily to what is hard science. And I think those norms can be broken down. I think we can start thinking bigger, because as I said earlier, even if we fail, we still end up in a better position than if we hadn't tried and have just gone for the traditional narrative. And if we can break down those unsubstantiated norms and get scientists to start thinking more broadly about what politically could be done, then I think they might then look more into the science. A lot of that already exists that might make that happen. But also they are there to criticize when politicians, when activists get their science wrong, and to come up with the ideas that's going to make us carry out restoration. How's this scientific funding going to come out? Because we need to have support from that. It could come out from people like venture capitalists, if we're going to tell this is a profitable stuff, restoration. It could come from philanthropists, but it also can come from research organizations, some of which are funded by philanthropists and other sorts, but also some of which are funded by the government as well. Therefore, if it's going to get that support, it needs some degree of societal support, because that drives the government to do certain parts of the investment, but also it needs support and consent and discussions in higher up, more powerful communities as well. If it gets popular there, philanthropists are more likely to give them money, governments are more likely to give them money. Charities also sometimes give out funding, although to a lesser extent, so it's probably slightly less important. Charities often do things both based off what is society in the zeitgeist, based off what the people think within the charity genuinely think, and also based on what their donors are then going to give them money for. So a lot of things are into play there, and therefore you need to convince and let a lot of people join this movement. Obviously come from governments. We've already talked about how we can drive government action. Comes from intergovernmental organizations. We've talked about how we can drive intergovernmental action. And also in terms of restoration, likely a lot of the funding is going to come from companies. But one of the two ways companies are probably likely to, three ways companies are likely to invest in this is just out of their goodwill. A couple of companies have already done things out of their goodwill. Very unlikely to be a very scalable model for this at all, because society kind of demands them to do it, or because politics demands them to do it, because politicians make their motivation for companies to invest in these technologies, or because people and consumers make their motivations. And finally, the main reason that they will do this, and this is something I think mainly governments have a responsibility of taking, although scientists and companies can also help create this as well, is if there is economic reasons for companies to invest, not just that people are pulling out the companies, but also that there's actually economic opportunities they can carry out, that we've created markets that we can then use to carry out removals and therefore carry out restoration. What I've actually just said mostly what companies can do. The main role companies will play will be helping develop the technologies to carry out restoration and actually carrying out restoration themselves. This is unless you believe in a really socialist status model, or like a fully government run model, in which case the companies, you could really sub this into kind of government agencies. Capitalist competition will likely reduce the cost of these technologies and therefore make restoration much more financially viable. They will show how climate change. They will show, sorry, how well they will show that technologies will work, or show that technologies will not work. And they can also give technologies legitimacy as well. I think you've got to look at what Climeworks has done for direct air capture. They had Greta Thunberg visiting there recently, and they've shown that both it can work, but also it's really expensive as well. But they can also highlight problems that arise. For example, Drax, which is carrying out bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. I'm not saying I'm an expert in what Drax business model is or anything, but one of the things that they do is they get all of their wood that they use to burn their power, to try to carry out negative emissions. They get that all the way from the USA, which has a huge, which the shipping obviously has a large carbon footprint. So it shows some of the problems that might arise with BECCS. And it's important that we recognize these problems before we start scaling things up to a huge scale. I'm not necessarily saying companies are good or this is a good economic model, but I'm saying that there is a really good way, there is a way that companies can play a role in this movement. This can be representatives. We've got a comment that says they can be representatives of how a transition can be conducted. Also, we all hope there's going to be a huge work transition in the future. Agreed, yes. Companies can show ways, can really show how a transition can happen. And actually, companies are not just showing how a transition can happen, are actually carrying out the transition as well, and are some of the most important institutions in our society, as well as being, in some cases, transnational companies in particular, are some of the wealthiest organizations and institutions on Earth. Next slide. Okay, and now I actually just realized I missed out the religion slide. I must have accidentally cut out the PowerPoint, apologies. When then the PowerPoint goes onto the website that we put in. But the other roles that I think something like religion can play in religious communities is religion is a very good way of organizing people. Religious communities, like when I went into civil society, religion is one of the key examples of that. And actually religious communities are some of the most tight-knit and some of the most reliable communities on Earth, and therefore could become very resistant to any sort of change that we want to bring about a restoration, or could be very much ones promoting changes or continuities as well. People like the Pope have some of the largest platforms in the world. There's over 1 billion Catholics that listen to someone like him, so that can have a huge impact. But also even on local scale, anything done on a local scale, religious communities are really great ways of people organizing. They're great ways of educating people, because a lot of education goes on within religious communities of people of all ages. And they're a great way of organizing people from many generations as well. Political movements in the past have had huge religious components to them. You just got to look at the civil rights movement in America, for example, who was literally led by a reverend. Because religious movements are so good at organizing things and so good at galvanizing people. So if we can get religious communities on board with restoration and working towards the sake of restoration, I think that's just another group of people that can both help us drive direct action, but also drive societal change in particular, because a lot of society is in religion. Most people in the world have a religion. Yeah, we can also our approach between different communities. The example is given as a concept within Judaism called Tikkun Olam, which is healing the world, and there's other concepts similar to that within other religions, and 100%. And the majority of the world fundamentally is religious, and so religion has great power over the way that society works. And final thing is also religious leaders give things legitimacy, both to the eyes of their congregants and the eyes outside of it. And religions, a lot of religions actually have a lot of money, which they can then use to help potentially carry out restoration, or help carry out campaigns for restoration. But agreed, we need to diverse changing between different religions, different movements of religions, different sects of religions. The more traditional parts of religions, the more liberal and more modern parts of religions, all sorts of things would have different approaches to this. Now I kind of move on to marking this by age group. What's the role of the youth? I've kind of shown 2 age groups, which are often, I think, which is important that I think we get on board in particular, but I think all age groups obviously are hugely important, and all age groups come into all the others. Why is it particularly important we get the youth involved? Because youth are future leaders of every single field that's currently been talked about. So we want this enduring impact for a century, let's say, or half a century. It's going to be young people making decisions over that time. The young people today making their decisions over that time. So if we create a culture among people of acceptance of restoration and support for restoration, then this is much more likely to be enduring. Young people are particularly active in the activist space and have always historically been so, and therefore really good ways of galvanizing and changing society. Young people have a lot of legitimacy. I think a lot of people listen when young people start speaking passionately about something. You've just got to look at Greta Thunberg, who went from an unknown 15-year-old in Sweden to a global superstar within a year. Young people have a lot of power, and young people.
Sorry, Ging, can I interject?
Yes, of course.
I think that the left-wing media listen when young people talk loudly. I think lots of people don't. I think lots of the time they're actually overlooked when the young people talk. And I think if I do agree actually with you, the young people do have a lot of power, but I think there's plenty of people over which they actually don't have a lot of power, and I think you're possibly overlooking that a little bit.
I actually fully agree with you. I think there is a lot of people that don't have power over, and that's why actually I move on to the next slide. I'm talking about the polar opposite of young people, which is obviously old people, because the other end of the age spectrum. Why also it's really important for them, a group of people that's often been ignored by the climate movement, to really get involved. But I'd actually kind of question, although a lot of the right wing tend to right wing media, I don't like using right and left. I don't think it's always true in all countries, but I know certainly from my experience in the UK, anyone from any other countries, feel free to interject and say this isn't correct in your country. But the right wing might even sometimes pretend they don't listen to young people. But you've just got to look at things like the net zero declaration by the government, which was happened under a conservative right wing government within the UK on the back of climate change action by young people. I think because I think the right is having a problem all around the world, and it is losing young people. And so if young people start speaking loudly about things, and the right can see a way that they can do these ideas in more conservative.
But that's the thing, though, isn't it? The young people speak the loudest, so they draw the most attention, and so therefore they can influence the politicians the most. Except if you're going to implement, let's say, a 50-year restoration policy, you need to win over everyone, not just people who are going to listen and shout the loudest. Like
I agree. People. We do need to win over everyone. But the other thing young people actually do is have an emotive appeal as well. If you've got to look at concerning climate change amongst all age groups across the political spectrum, on the current wave of youth activism, it is hugely peaked across the entire political spectrum. I think young people also, one thing young people have is time. The time they're willing to give to this, they have passion, and also they have less responsibility as well. Once you get people, particularly into their middle age, they have a lot of responsibility and therefore can often become less active political actors just because of particularly in creating a new movement. This is not always the case. Young people have this less responsibility, so can take kind of more riskier approach. And finally, I think one thing young people are struggling for in society a lot is a sense of community and wanting that, and a movement can help create that. The other group that I think has often been overlooked in climate activism, and I think is really important to get on board, is actually old people as well. And obviously there's also a huge, most of the population in between, but I mean like retirees as well. What do old people have? Because I think a lot of hate actually in things like the climate movement towards old people who they see as causing the climate crisis. Well, number one, the idea of restoration is an idea of cleanup in particular. It's an idea of we made a mess, so let's clean it up. I think that principle is an inherently quite conservative one, but also kind of one which I think resonates a lot strongly with quite a lot of people who grew up in the past. And I actually think it's sad that I think that principle of kind of cleanup has been getting lost slightly. But they also older people have because a lot of older people were responsible for a lot of the emissions of the past, and actually it's untrue to say young people aren't responsible for emissions. There are more emissions recently than in the past, but that's the way the movement is going at the moment. It gives them the idea of cleanup legitimacy. They also, I'm going to answer the question in the chat right now. How about elders? Karen, would you like to clarify what you mean by that? Hello?
Hey, just instead of old people, I don't know, a more respectful term perhaps, but also something that gives weight to folks who are culturally, regarded as experts and as authorities and as keepers of the youth within the society. We don't do that very well, at least here in the United States, but in most cultures throughout time, there have been roles for elders. And I think that we're maybe trying to to recognize that, you know, by giving them a slide, right? So
Yeah.
elders versus older.
Yeah, in reality, the main reason I didn't use the word elders is that elders has, in some contexts, become associated with different groups of individuals rather than the age bracket as a whole. But I agree, maybe, yeah, I better but like, yeah, I kind of get what you mean, and I think that is one of the key other reasons to get people who are older or elders on board with this is that they've lived their life, they deserve a huge amount of respect, and they deserve to have their voices listened to just as much as young people do. And so if we can get them on board with this, we've got a weight of experience, we've also got a on board, we've got a really legitimate and voice on board as well, which I think is really important. And I think old people are often overlooked in terms of activism. But I actually think most older people have a passion for the future and have a care for the future of the world, for the future of their community, for the future of their family, whatever it is. And I think they are people who would be really beneficial to have as a real strong part of this movement. And restoration of everyone wants a better life for their kids and for their kids' kids and for their grandkids and all of that. And I think restoration really leads to that idea of that. Again, older people tend to also, particularly once they're retired, have time they can dedicate towards this. But they've also, more importantly than that, they've got skills to share because they've had a life of establishing these skills, they've had a life of experience. And this movement could do so well if we got that kind of benefit of that. And finally, again, I think there's a real problem, particularly in the West, that older people are getting respected less by their communities and also are having, and I don't think that's right. And I think this can help change that. This is, for anyone who's wondering when this is finishing, this is probably only going to carry on for another 15 minutes. It's very near the end, and then we've got questions. And I think there needs to be a lot of intergenerational dialogue as well. And fundamentally, we need this to be intergenerational. I've said younger people and older people, but it needs also all the people in between who also have unique things. Every single person is unique. We need many people, a broad cross-section of society involved. Why does it need to be diverse nationally? And this is where I started to get back to the idea that this is internationalist. It's internationalist. It doesn't just need to be diverse nationally because we're globalists or because we're internationalists. But fundamentally, climate restoration, I meant to say rather than climate change, as it says there, is a global solution to a global problem and therefore requires a global response, even if that global response is made up of lots of little individual responses. If you have a diverse national movement and therefore is pushing for it in a lot of countries, and therefore national governments are forced to act, it reduces the chance, I think, of free riderism, where if governments have only got pressure from other governments or only got pressure from intergovernmental organizations, that they won't do anything because other countries are doing it. And I think if we've got the pressure from internally and from all sorts of internal society as well as from companies which are also international as well, then that problem is reduced. We also live in a globalized world, whether we like that or not. Companies are global, supply chains are global. If we want to carry out restoration on the scale and removals on the scale needed, it's going to need these global companies, it's going to need these global supply chains, it's going to, and therefore we need to have a diverse national movement to make sure these things happen. Academia and research is a very globalist, and it goes all around the world. If we can increase communication between researchers all over the world, with much communication, collaboration, and competition, all three which I think can lead to new great ideas being developed, then we can really help accelerate the development of these technologies. It allows for the most amount of possible energy to dedicate it to this. I don't mean energy in the scientific context. I mean like political energy to be dedicated to this. We want as many people on board as possible. It's much more likely to be raised at the UN if you've got people from all sorts of countries being involved in this. But I'm not saying this makes climate restoration a globalist or internationalist cause. To carry out climate restoration, you don't need to think that we need to have immigrants coming into our country from all over the world and we need to open our borders up. It doesn't mean you have to think we have to have free trade or we have to join trade blocs or that it needs to be associated with any traditional internationalist movements. This is why I said diverse nationally rather than kind of international. It really needs a lot of different movements from a lot of different places coming together and working in tandem with each other, or even like against each other, but towards the common aim. But also it can be globalist and internationalist as well. And I also think that is a real common fault line, particularly in a lot of the world, of how global looking countries want to be. And I'm just saying, even if this does require international cooperation, even if this does require international competition, that doesn't mean this has to be globalist or internationalist. And I think the kind of, look, as you see, I've not got many slides left. The real thing I'm trying to suggest, I've given you a really in-depth look at this movement. And I'm sorry, but I don't think there would have been really other way I could have done without diving in properly. Why am I making this so broad? Because the climate crisis is so severe. It's not worth risking the good to achieve the perfect. It's not worth saying, I want to achieve let's say I'm a socialist, I want to achieve a socialist utopia, and I'm going to carry that out by campaigning eco-socialism. And the only people that I should allow to campaign to combat the climate crisis would be eco-socialists, otherwise I call everyone out as eco-fascists. I'm not saying that there's many people that think that, but there are some people that think that. But I think the climate crisis is so severe that it's not worth risking it for any other aims. We can have a debate about socialism outside of this. We can have a debate about whether climate restoration should be carried out with socialism or capitalism. But the idea of climate restoration can't just be limited to one group. Because I'm of the opinion, I think a lot of people actually are, that even if you make strongly favour one side of an economics argument or a political argument, that actually things can happen geophysically on both sides. Climate restoration is really a geophysical aim, right? It's let's remove as much CO2 from the atmosphere as possible. The political aims up to that point, we need a diverse range of that, because it's just not worth risking this thing of huge geophysical importance and huge national importance to every single person, no matter their political orientation. It's not worth it. Risking it for just hoping to have some other, to get some of your other aims forwards. We have to recognise different people are motivated by hugely different things, and different people have hugely different economic, social, political ideas. Different people would do things for different reasons. Different companies would do things for different reasons. Different organisations would do things for different reasons. But that doesn't mean they can't work towards the same aim, even if the way they get there and what it looks like in the end is radically different. If the geophysical consequences of it are the same, lives are still saved. And that's always a thing to be important. This is what I'm saying. And also, we have to recognise, as much as we may like our political side won't always win. And if it's going to have the longevity, it needs to be broader. Fundamentally, we need to be pragmatists and look at this and say, what is our aim? Our aim is let's stop millions of lives from being killed, and let millions of people from being killed, and let's save millions of people from suffering. And say, how do we do that? Well, we do that by stopping climate change getting worse, and then removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to restore it. None of that stuff is politically controversial. The stuff that is politically controversial, where real political discussions, take out science denial for a second, which sadly is a political issue for some countries, but is actually, I think, getting less. Whereas this, all the other discussions about how you carry this out will end up leading, if they're all implemented effectively, will end up leading to the same geophysical aim. So this movement needs to be about achieving that geophysical ambition. And there can be many political paths to that geophysical ambition. And the end result, politically and economically, will look very different. But in terms of the climate and in terms of the number of lives saved, will not. We also need to have a bit of modesty about ourselves, saying we may hold real strong political views, right? But fundamentally, we can't be 100% certain that really we're correct, that our reading of the economy is correct, and actually other people have things to offer. And as I've said, this is too important for our hubris to think that our economic and social and political idea is best to get in the way of just achieving the importance of geophysical ambition. And the broader a campaign is, the more likely it is to succeed. So I just want to finish off this presentation by doing two things: saying what Worldwood's role is, then saying what your own role is, and any questions. So if anyone can really think of questions and discussion, that can carry on for as long as anyone wants. Or by the way, if anyone needs to go at any point, feel free to leave. But what's Worldwood's role, our organisation, what we're meant to be doing? We are, one of the key things we're trying to do is create this movement. That's what this is. Create this movement in our own small way. And we want loads of other organisations also doing this, but we want to create the movement to start with. We're not going to be the entire movement though. Creating the movement does not mean being the movement. How are we going to do this? we're going to do it first by the bottom-up approach. Why are we going to first use the bottom-up approach? Because we're citizens. We can't do the top-down approach because I'm not at the UN, I'm not in government, we don't have people in those positions. So this is the only way we can start. As an organisation, we are internationally and politically diverse to show a way that the movement can go forwards. We want to share and promote various economic and political conceptions that different movements can carry out. Just because I want to promote a broad movement for restoration doesn't mean we can't have organisations promoting restoration in one specific way or another specific way. But it means that we need multiple organisations promoting multiple different things. And Worldwood's going to try to create that, in part by exploring different economic and political conceptions of how to carry out restoration. We want to collaborate with other movements across the political spectrum, not even ones that won't collaborate with each other. We collaborate with them to provide them with the resources that are needed, to provide them with the expertise needed, and all things like this. We want to make restoration part of the mainstream climate movement, both the mainstream left-wing part of the climate movement, but the mainstream right-wing part of the climate movement. We want to work with scientists, we want to work with people at the UN, we want to work with politicians, we want to work with media to get the message out about restoration. We're going to educate, we're going to raise awareness, we're going to empower people so they can go back to their own organisations, be them companies, be them radical anarchist organisations, be them radical free market organisations, and show how their model of restoration might work. I may say their model of restoration may be bad and try to argue fully against their model of restoration, but the fact that discussion's happening shows healthy political debate. And we're going to create resources to develop more and more ideas. We want to be the people that catalyse different organisations to claim they're part of the movement, right? Just because there will be organisations in this movement that will hugely disagree with each other. But just like there are organisations that hugely disagree within the economy, doesn't mean they're not all trying to make the economy better. They're not all succeeding, they're all at least trying. And that's the aim of this, is we want to try towards restoration. And to do that, we need organisations that are going to disagree with each other. Need organisations across the spectrum. And Worldwood is here trying to start that, be the flame that starts the movement. But we'd hope other organisations will come along. If another organisation came along and stole that from us and created this movement, and other organisations on both sides of the spectrum and all over started doing things, we'd love it. So what's your role? If you want to become part of this movement in any way, maybe you believe actually the only way we can carry this out is by a free market approach that really is company focused, in which case do that. If you believe the only way we can do this is by creating a Green New Deal, do that. But one thing you can do is join us. If you're passionate just about creating a movement and not about one specific way of doing it, join Worldwood. Worldwood is doing that, and Worldwood is showing different ways it could be done. Join us, join our volunteer training program. It's a lot of fun. It's less talking than this, a lot of discussion. You get to meet new people, but also you get to change the world. Also think about all those categories I spoke about. Which category do you fit in, right? And maybe can you do it? You're a company that might be able to promote restoration. Are you part of a political party? Let's say you're in the UK, you're part of the Conservative Party. What can the Conservative Party do to promote restoration? Or you're part of the student climate strikes and Fridays for Future. What can Fridays for Future do to be promoting the idea of restoration? Or you're part of all sorts of things. I'm not saying every single person who's in this movement needs to be promoting a broad church idea. You can promote a very specific idea. Can you help promote legitimacy? Are you a voice that if you sign something, if you speak out about it, people are going to listen and more people are going to know? Can you help promote political change, even in just the way you vote or the way you talk to people? Can you help us create different conceptions of what restoration can be? Or can you go back to other movements, other roles you're in, and help create conceptions of what restoration can be? Have you been part of any other movements that you think might be able to support it, be them left-wing, be them right-wing, be them capitalist, be them socialist, be them all sorts of things? Can they help support restoration in some way or another, or help promote restoration? What communities are you part of? How can you educate people on restoration? How can you empower people on education? How can you spread this message? How can you make society embrace restoration? You can help educate and spread the message, spread your own message about restoration, join us to spread our message, and just discuss it, debate it, argue about how to carry out restoration. Obviously, I would love for you to join our organisation, which is about creating this movement. But I also understand some people might be passionate about one conception of restoration. So go out and argue why your conception of restoration is the best. Or go out and create discussion. Go out and make restoration a legitimate aim.